All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome to Lunch Break Apostasies. We are getting very close to the end of this series. In fact, we are now done with all of the portions which I consider most important at this point. We've gone through all the things you're likely to run into, or at least things that are very similar to that. They might have a similar tradition with it. If we were to literally go through every single religion and denomination, it would just be impossible. Too many new ones would have formed by the time we were to thoroughly explore every single one of them. However, generally speaking, I think if you go through all of it, you'd have a pretty good idea of the typical religious landscape that you'll fall into now. That being said, we're not quite completely finished, as there are a couple of Christian denominations or, apostasies, which we want to talk about for a couple of different reasons. Partially just because of how highly requested they are, not necessarily how likely you are to run into them. And in the case of the one today, yeah, there's a good chance you'll run into somebody with this. However, it's not necessarily a lot of uniquenesses from a doctrinal standpoint. One of the things I've been harping on from the very beginning is that you can't pigeonhole people into certain beliefs. Unfortunately, it would be easy sometimes if we could know that if someone said, "Hey, I'm a Methodist," it'd be nice if you could immediately then know exactly what they believe. But I think I've demonstrated at this point that it just doesn't work that way. You can have an idea of what they might believe, however. And there are many denominations which have origin essentially within the last 100 years or so, which are not defined by their doctrinal standpoints. There have been a lot of splits within denominations now. It's a very odd thing where you have all these denominations. A lot of times they'll even have the same names, but it can tell you almost nothing about said denomination. And the one we're going to be talking about now is the United Church of Christ. I expect the reason this one was so commonly requested was because it has a name very similar to the Church of Christ, which, if you don't know, I'm a member of that. But if you were to go into a United Church of Christ service, it'd be something far, far different. In fact, in almost every way, at least from an appearance standpoint, is the exact opposite of the Church of Christ, which I expect is why it gets um, uh, asked about so often. It's not really all that distinctive from many other theologically liberal denominations, however, but it is a really good representation of what we call mainline Christianity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And so I thought this would be a good one to talk about anyway, because although, yes, we're talking about the United Church of Christ, many other denominations are going to fit under a lot of the things that fall within the United Church of Christ. Before we do so, as is our common habit, we are going to talk about something that is a good thing, something true to be found within our last apostasy. Of course, last week we were talking about Pentecostalism. And I think if there's something good with it to be found within there, it's certainly the zeal of the Pentecostals. I don't know if anybody could really claim that they aren't zealous by any means. Of course, they take this to an extreme quite often. The most extreme would be the versions of Pentecostals that we see trying to perform modern day miracles, such as faith healers, or you also might see that with the snake handlers as well. But even those who don't take it to such extremes usually do take it to extremes of tongue speaking and the like. Zealousness is certainly a great thing. I don't know if anybody could deny that there are people within the Pentecostal religion. I'm sure there are charlatans among them. There are charlatans among any group. But to me, it seems there are very sincere people within that apostasy as well. That being said, sincerity and zealousness alone are not enough in order to make it to a point of religious acceptability, a point where you're not apostatizing. There have been plenty of sincere and zealous apostates. So I do appreciate the zealousness, though. No new questions to mention, and so we'll go ahead and jump right in uh, to our topic, which is, of course, the United Church of Christ. All right. The history of the United Church of Christ starts with a group known as the Congregationalists. You might recall that from our history of the Baptists that we did, the Baptists don't really pop up. It's occasionally asserted they were founded by a man named John Smith, although I haven't been able to find many sources that seem to be able to verify that. I'm no historian, and so I don't claim to be uh, fantastic at that particular exercise, but it seems to me that's not particularly validatable. Uh, Instead, they appear to slowly form out of the Puritan tradition. The Puritans form out of the idea in England that the Church of I'm sorry, the Church of England, also known as the Anglicans, they pop out of Catholicism, but not really from a principled standpoint, rather as at the whims of Henry VIII for his particular needs at that time. And although it was reformed by Elizabeth I, it still wasn't really what many people in England thought a truly reformed church ought to be. As we've said before, it is often considered to be the most Catholic of the Protestant denominations. The church, therefore, didn't satisfy a lot of people around. Of course, this is why you have the Reformed Church in Scotland, known pretty much as the Presbyterians. And then you also have the Puritans in England. Now, they had various times of success and not so much success within England itself. It'd be a very good thing to be a Puritan during the immediate aftermath of the English Civil War. But at other times, not quite so much. And they end up leaving en masse and mostly going to the colonies, famously, mostly in New England. Now, as we mentioned, most of the people who go over to New England, they eventually change over into being the Baptists, which was a subsection of the Puritans. And we mentioned some of the complexities with that, but if you want to know the really short form version of what the difference is, the big difference was either we're going to be true 5-point Calvinists or we're going to be the 4-point Calvinists. Now, at first, that wasn't so much of a difference. That was a difference within the Baptists. But as time goes on, that seems to be the big difference from the mainline Puritans into the Baptists. Well, as time goes on, the Puritans need to be able to distinguish themselves from the Presbyterians, which are starting to have an influence on America as well. The big difference then from the Puritans to the Americans, or I'm sorry, from the Presbyterians, is the polity. How are we going to organize things? Presbyterians have a Presbyterian polity. In fact, even denominations which are not Presbyterian in their name often have a Presbyterian polity. That means that they are held over in a very strong organization, going from elders up into synods, there's a strong leadership. Well, the Puritans often believed in what is called congregational polity. That is, that it's more of an association of congregations, but there is no authority higher than that of the congregation, and each congregation gets to make its own decisions. And so, slowly over time, the Puritans start calling themselves Congregationalists. And the Congregationalists were highly influential in New England. Many prominent American universities were formed by the Congregationalists, namely Harvard and Yale, very big Congregationalist universities. In fact, they were originally formed as seminaries. And by the time you get to the First Great Awakening, this is one of the great times for the Congregationalists. Jonathan Edwards, who along with George Whitefield is probably the most famous preachers of the First Great Awakening, he was a Congregationalist. You might have heard of his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So that's what the Congregationalists looked like. The congregation, and by the way, you'll still find places that are called Congregational even today. And those are ones that have not been part of the big mergers that have been involved since then. And we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. As we mentioned, there have been many mergers within the United Church of Christ. It starts, in my opinion, around the mid 19th century, in the mid 1800s. This is when you see the beginning of the flourishment of biblical criticism. Um, that's really when you get some strange ideas regarding the Bible, such as, for example, the non-existence of the historical Jesus. You don't really see that asserted very often in history up until about the 19th century. This is when you get the idea of a Christian who does not believe in the literal nature of the Bible, is around this time. In addition to some of these movements that are pretty common, and by the way, it seems that the congregational churches are at the forefront of these, you also have a strong eclectic movement going slowly, but nevertheless going around this time. And that's actually comes out of the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. Um, Something I talked about when we talked about the Restoration movement was the importance of eclecticism within, or eclecticism, or I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. I'm not always necessarily the best with words. The importance of an eclectic movement here. The idea, especially in Stone's mind, was that all Christians ought to be able to unite under Scripture alone. Remove the doctrines that are not based upon the Bible. Remove all of the creeds, and then what you get is just a Christian. And of course, this was very much similar to what you see in Campbell, and thus you see a merge within these two movements. However, when biblical criticism was added to the mix, you get the modern eclectic movement, which is extremely similar, but there's one detail which changes absolutely everything, and that is, what are we going to merge over? The modern idea is essentially merge over nothing. Now, nobody is going to say that. Usually they'll say something like, well, we'll merge around Christ. But what do you mean when you say that? Do you mean you're going to merge around the teachings of Christ? Because I notice that you seem quite eager to merge with those who do not agree with the teachings of Christ. They might agree with some, but they tend to pick and choose. Um, at other times, we have, by the way, they wouldn't even claim this. Once again, our example of the Westboro Baptist Church, well, they definitely claim to be following Christ, but I don't know of anybody who is eager to merge with them. I don't even think most Baptists want to merge with them, let alone the greater denominational world. So it has to be around something. But this eclectic movement is merging around nothing at all, in effect. Well, the Congregationalists merge with the Evangelical Protestant Church of North America. This is a type of German Reformed church in 1925. As a result, it tends to take on many what we consider Lutheran aspects to it. High church, very liturgical, that sort of thing. Um, Much like the Methodist merger we saw in the 60s uh, when they merged with the United Brethren. Really, the main difference at that point was just the language and culture. And as German culture became more and more absorbed into American culture within the late 19th century, the differences between the two became less important, so you have a merger over there. Another merger occurred with the Christian Connection in 1931. The Christian Connection were the remnants also coming from Stone's movement in particular. Remember, in the Stone Campbell movement, you first have a Stone movement and a Campbell movement, if we're going to call them that. Really, that's not even the best names for them, but for sake of ease, we'll call them that. When Stone merged with Campbell, there were beforehand he was part of a group. They called themselves the Christian Connection because of Stone's desire to simply call themselves Christians or the Christian Church. Both, by the way, are perfectly biblical names for it. And so Stone liked the name Christian. And then also, you see some of the names that Campbell would throw around. Disciples of Christ, once again, a perfectly biblical name. Church of Christ, once again, biblical name. Stone's Christian Connection did not dissolve when he merged with Campbell's movement. He and many followers went over there, but many stayed within this Christian Connection, and that remained its own denomination for about 100 years. And it also went the same way as many of the liberalizing denominations that you see out of the Restoration movement. We talked about the Christian churches slash disciples of Christ. All of that went together, and they went in a very similar direction. And so, having gone a similar direction as the Congregationalist, particularly with the theological liberalism, they found a common cause and merged as well. You now have a new denomination, which is known as the Christian Congregational Christian Church. It ends up merging with the Evangelical Reformed Church. It starts in, I believe, 1943, and it manages to merge in 1957. What's interesting about this one is that the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which is also in of itself a merger, it has Presbyterian polity. Ironically, the Congregationalists, which is what they have been up to this point, they're defining the thing that is in their name. They are now merging with a denomination which is the opposite of it. Presbyterian polity versus congregational polity. We now have a merger there. There were some congregations of the Congregationalists that left as a result of this, but you now have this merging, forming what is now known as the United Church of Christ. Now, the beliefs of the modern United Church of Christ tend to be more focused on political causes and an outward change of the world rather than focusing inward. They hold very little as theologically necessary, as you can imagine, if the thing that has defined them by their name is being something they'll merge over, then very little is held as theologically necessary. The Canadian version, which they do hold. They haven't merged with them, but as I recall, one of their synod resolutions was to hold fellowship with them. The Canadian version of this church has appointed pastors, which are atheists, to give you an idea of how little the importance of theology is within this church. Mainly focuses on liberal political causes rather than individual religious piety. Some have stated that they are essentially trying to create a heaven on earth, which might make sense if you have bought into biblical criticism. Well, if the Bible isn't really true, if it's not the unerring inspired word of God, then you can pick and choose which parts you like, but there is no greater authority, really, than yourself as to the theological side of things. And although you still have some of that congregational polity, you might have a United Church of Christ that doesn't agree with the general synods of the United Church of Christ. They have made some very strong political statements, some including statements calling for the removal of fossil fuels, statements on certain cultural anomalies. As an example, they made a statement against the Washington Redskins, when that was still the name of the team, and calling for tax reform as well. I was very careful with which one of these statements I picked out to point out how extremely different from the Bible this is. Jesus made it extremely clear that during his life, he was not there to create heaven on earth. He wasn't trying to influence the physical nations in that manner. When asked if he was a king by Pilate, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight, but my kingdom is not from here." Again, when Jesus was asked if they ought to pay taxes to a wicked and corrupt government, he simply says, "Render Caesar, unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. The point being this: yes, it is acceptable for a Christian to influence the world around him, even the nations around him, but that is not the goal of the Christian. The only person you are required to influence and the person that you have control over is yourself. I picked these statements because these are non-biblically important statements. Um, I, generally speaking, try very hard, especially when I'm in the context of preaching, to avoid talking about political statements that are not biblically important. Those three, I have my political opinions on all the three of those, but I'm not really going to share those too much unless they run into biblically important things. Um, and there are biblically, with all three of them, you can make a biblical connection to it, right? You might say with fossil fuels that could go into the environment, and then that goes into the treatment and stewardship of the earth. I mean, there's a biblical connection there with cultural anomalies. You could talk about the very real biblical topic of racism, and then you could be talking about the biblical topic of helping the poor. But with each of those, there is a step between the religious side and the political side, which probably should be acknowledged. Um, in which, honestly, a Christian, from a religious standpoint, has no business uh, involving themselves in. And from a wisdom standpoint, it doesn't really make much sense for a Christian to prioritize this. These are all things that are going to go away eventually anyway. We ought to focus on the Word of God alone. My brother-in-law, Marcus Stenson, recently posted a clip from a sermon he gave, talking about the effect that focusing on political movements rather than religious importance has on that religious importance. Leander Church of Christ, by the way, I encourage you to go check them out and look that up. He makes some very good points. There are other things, however, which the Church, United Church of Christ, has encouraged and allowed within its and even made statements highly in support of and condemning any sort of opposition to, which are very much biblical issues such as homosexuality and abortion. Um, the Bible tells you it's wrong to kill babies even if they haven't been born yet. It tells you that there are limitations upon human sexuality. We're not animals that are required to follow every single sexual instinct or motivation that we might have. This is highly denied by the United Church of Christ. Many of the religious rights are highly liberal. We mentioned the allowance and necessary acceptance of homosexual marriage, as we see pictured there. You have female pastors, openly gay pastors, etc., etc. Once again, I don't believe this has happened yet within the American side of things, but the Canadian one does have even atheist pastors. Surprisingly enough, or at least it was surprising to me, it still has a highly liturgical worship style, which you might have been able to ascertain from uh, what you've seen some of their pastors wearing, even though it's filled with, well, quite frankly, homosexual propaganda. Um, Even though that is there, it's still in the form of a very liturgical style of worship. Um, and even though historically, once again, this is a highly Calvinistic denomination, many of the churches within there, they still have abandoned Calvinism. I'd like to use this to quickly springboard into the idea of the mainline church, which falls under this. And we've talked about a couple of these, but as I've mentioned, just because a denomination holds a certain name, it doesn't really mean that it has a lot in common with everybody who holds that same denominational name. For example, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has is about as much in common with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod as the Catholics do. And in fact, you could probably say that the Southern Baptist Convention has more in common with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod does than the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. That's because the Evangelical Lutheran Church falls under what we call mainline churches. Generally, there are seven sisters considered to be part of the mainline churches. Those would be the United Methodist, the Presbyterian Church USA, United Church of Christ, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, American Baptist Churches USA, and the Episcopal Church. Although I think there are many others that might consider themselves mainline today. All of these are quickly declining, and from a historical standpoint, they gain the name mainline. You might confuse the name mainline with mainstream, but what you'll find is within the denominational studies world, mainline usually refers to these churches or churches that are very similar to them, not necessarily popular churches. These are not the most populous churches, but they're considered mainline. The story goes specifically because of the city of Philadelphia. These are the churches that could be found right by the train station. And often these are the denominations that might be, if you live in a city, right around the main street. There might be a Catholic church somewhere, but these tend to be the ones that are considered the upper crust of society. Historically, they have been considered very upper class and racially homogenous. So rich white people generally went to these um, within urban environments. That being said, I don't know if you, well, even today, most of the population of these churches are extremely racially homogenous, probably richer as well. They're rapidly declining as they are tend to be much older too. Um, that being said, the term mainline churches has kind of shifted to. This takes too long to get it to come back on. I need to be more animated. It won't happen if that happens. The term mainline churches really seems to be almost synonymous now with the idea of theologically liberal churches. And then the one that is described as theologically conservative churches tends to be the term evangelical. Now, many churches with the term evangelical would then further, who would consider themselves evangelical, which, by the way, doesn't have much to do with the title. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America does not fall under the category of evangelicals. Do you see the problem of the confusion here, by the way? Well, anyway. Evangelicals would often distinguish themselves from fundamentalists, and there's a few different things that make one evangelical or fundamentalist. Oh boy. As you might be starting to see, it's difficult to really categorize these within the 20th century onward, which is why we're not so much focused on that anymore. Really, what you're going to want to focus on, and this has always been the case, is finding out what the beliefs are, seeing if they match with the Bible or not. And if they don't, we got to ask ourselves the question, how come what I'm doing is not matching what the Church of the Bible was doing? Um, anyway, when it comes to just about all of the mainline churches, what you'll generally find is that they are very similar to the United Church of Christ. They might not be as far liberal. United Church of Christ is usually considered about the most liberal outside of the United Unitarians, which don't even consider themselves Christian. So I don't know if we could really uh, consider them within the spectrum of denominationalism and more like, false religion entirely. But usually, most mainline churches are going to go in that direction, and they generally have the same features. Most of them are declining pretty heavily because, of course, there's no standard within there. If what makes your church special is something that can be found within the world, which, essentially is just political liberalism, it's not really all that special. There's no real reason to join it. Um, so it makes sense that these are declining. The United Church of Christ is probably the most rapidly declining of these. I mean, they suffered what was it I saw? I think it was nearly 50% of a loss of their population within the last 20 years or so. One that's not going as much as the United Methodist Church, but that's of course changed a lot recently with their recent drama. And there's also drama within the Presbyterian Church, and so they're very quickly declining. Most Christianity, by the way, is declining within America, but these ones seem to be at the forefront of the speed of declining. A lot of things you see with this are going to be similar to the Bible. Really, the discussion to have with somebody who is within these churches, it's not going to be about the denomination itself. Really, what you have to establish is the inerrancy, inspiration, and importance of the Bible. Uh, and then after that, I mean, that's the universal Bible study. If you can get somebody to understand that, then if they're honest, they'll be able to study themselves out of these pretty quickly. Anyway, that concludes our thoughts for the United Church of Christ. We're going to have one more Apostasies special, and that will conclude this particular series. I am planning on studying the Bible with you some more in the near future. I'm going to have a break a little bit, mainly for West Virginia Christian Youth Camp, which is quickly coming upon us. And by the way, if you happen to live in West Virginia or nearby and you have children or children in your life, let me tell you that makes a gigantic difference in the lives of so many children. Cannot encourage you enough to send somebody there. Made a huge difference in my life. And one more apostasy we'll be doing here, and it is pretty much only by popular demand, because chances are you're never going to talk to somebody who actually believes this. But it has made a cultural difference in the modern day, I have to admit. And that is the Church of Scientology. So we will be talking about the Church of Scientology next week, and then that will be it for Lunch Break Apostasies. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Until I see you next time, thank you so much for watching. Love you all. You have a good day.